It was late summer in 1976, and the children of Bay City, Michigan, were squeezing the last drops of freedom from their vacation before school started again. The streets were lined with modest homes, well-kept lawns, and the kind of quiet that only exists in small industrial towns where everyone knows everyone else's business. Bay City sat along the Saginaw River, a place built on lumber and shipbuilding, a place where families had lived for generations and where trust was assumed, not earned. On the afternoon of August 23, 1976, two little girls were playing in a yard on the east side of town. The day was warm, humid, the kind of heat that makes the air feel thick. The older girl was 5 years old. Her name was Katherine Morrison. The younger one, just 4, was her cousin, Amy Sullivan. They were inseparable that summer, always together, always laughing. Their families lived 3 blocks apart, and the girls spent nearly every day running between backyards, riding bikes, playing with dolls on the front porch. That afternoon, they were in the Morrisons' backyard, drawing with chalk on the driveway. Katherine's mother, Linda, was inside folding laundry. Amy's mother, Diane, had dropped her off an hour earlier and was running errands across town. It was normal. It was safe. It was a Tuesday. And then, they were gone. Before I reveal the decades of silence, false leads, and the arrest that stunned a community that thought it had buried this story forever, go ahead and subscribe. These stories are told to make sure the truth doesn't disappear with time. Now, let me ask you something. If 2 children vanished from your street, and no one could explain how, would you ever feel safe again? Linda Morrison came outside at 4:15 that afternoon to call the girls in for a snack. She expected to see them on the driveway, chalk dust on their hands, arguing over whose turn it was to draw next. But the driveway was empty. The chalk was still there, scattered across the pavement in bright, broken pieces. She called their names. No answer. She walked around the side of the house, looked in the garage, checked the front yard. Nothing. She told herself they must have wandered to a neighbor's house. Katherine knew the rules: stay in the yard, don't leave without asking, but she was 5. Maybe she forgot. Maybe Amy wanted to see the neighbor's new puppy. Linda walked next door, knocked, asked if anyone had seen the girls. No one had. She walked to the next house. Then the next. By the time she reached the 4th neighbor, her voice was shaking. Diane Sullivan got the call at 4:45. She was at the grocery store, standing in the checkout line, when the cashier told her there was an urgent phone call. She ran to the manager's office. Linda was crying on the other end of the line, barely able to get the words out. The girls were missing. They'd been gone for more than half an hour. Diane dropped everything and drove straight back. By 5 o'clock, a dozen neighbors were walking the streets, calling the girls names. By 6, the Bay City Police Department had officers canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on every door, asking if anyone had seen 2 little girls, one in a yellow sundress, one in denim shorts and a white t-shirt. By nightfall, the entire east side of Bay City was searching. The first 24 hours were chaos. Police set up a command post in the Morrisons' living room. Linda sat on the couch, her hands clenched together, her eyes red and swollen. Diane paced the hallway, calling out to officers every few minutes, asking if there was any news. Detectives interviewed everyone who lived within 6 blocks. They asked about strangers, unusual cars, anything out of the ordinary. No one had seen anything. One neighbor mentioned a white van that had been parked at the end of the street earlier that day, but he couldn't remember the time or whether anyone had been inside. Another said she'd heard a car door slam around 4 o'clock, but she hadn't looked out the window. These were the kinds of details that felt important in the moment but dissolved into nothing when detectives tried to follow them. Search teams combed the riverbanks, checked abandoned buildings, walked through parks and wooded areas. Volunteers from across Saginaw County showed up with flashlights and walkie-talkies, forming lines and moving slowly through fields and along the edges of roads. Local news stations ran stories every hour. Flyers with the girls' photos were taped to every storefront window, every telephone pole, every gas station bulletin board. Katherine Morrison and Amy Sullivan. 5 and 4 years old. Last seen in the backyard of 412 East Taft Street. Days passed. Then a week. Then too. The phone tips poured in, sightings in Detroit, in Flint, in Toledo. Every lead was followed. Every single one led nowhere. What no one realized at the time was that the answer was closer than anyone imagined. On September 4, 1976, 12 days after the girls disappeared, a man walking his dog along a service road near the Saginaw River noticed something unusual in the tall grass near the water's edge. At first, he thought it was a bundle of old clothes, discarded trash. But as he got closer, he saw a small hand. He stopped. His dog kept pulling at the leash, but the man didn't move. He stood there for a long moment, his stomach turning, and then he ran back to his car and drove to the nearest payphone. Police arrived within minutes. By the time the medical examiner's team reached the site, a perimeter had been set up, and officers were walking the area in a grid pattern, searching for anything that might have been left behind. The bodies of Katherine Morrison and Amy Sullivan were found together, partially hidden beneath overgrown brush. They had been there for days, maybe longer. The location was less than 2 miles from Katherine's house, a stretch of undeveloped land that separated Bay City from the river. It wasn't a place people went. It wasn't on the way to anywhere. It was isolated, quiet, and easy to overlook. The autopsies were conducted the following day. The results were not released to the public, but detectives briefed the families privately. Both girls had been strangled. There was no evidence of sexual assault. The medical examiner estimated they had died within hours of their disappearance, likely on the same day they were taken. The news hit Bay City like a physical blow. The search had been driven by hope, by the belief that the girls were still out there, frightened but alive, waiting to be found. Now that hope was gone. The community didn't just grieve, it recoiled. Parents pulled their children inside. Neighbors stopped making eye contact. The east side of town, which had always felt safe, suddenly felt exposed. Diane Sullivan collapsed when the police told her. Linda Morrison sat in silence, staring at the wall, unable to cry, unable to speak. Their husbands tried to hold the families together, but there was nothing to hold on to. The girls were gone. And no one knew who had taken them. The investigation intensified immediately. Detectives from the Bay City Police Department were joined by officers from the Michigan State Police and investigators from the FBI. They re-interviewed everyone who had been questioned in the first 2 weeks. They examined the crime scene with forensic tools that were, by today's standards, rudimentary. They collected soil samples, fibers, and a few strands of hair that were found near the bodies. But in 1976, DNA analysis didn't exist. What they had were fragments, pieces of evidence that might mean something or might mean nothing. Detectives focused on known offenders in the area. They pulled files on every registered sex offender within a 50-mile radius, brought them in for questioning, checked their alibis. Some had none. Some were evasive. But no one could be definitively connected to the crime. They looked at family members, though carefully. The Morrisons and the Sullivans were devastated, but detectives had to rule them out. Both mothers had alibis. Both fathers had been at work. Extended family members were interviewed, their movements accounted for. Nothing pointed inward. The white van mentioned by the neighbor became a focal point. Police issued a public appeal, asking anyone who had seen a white van in the area on August 23 to come forward. Dozens of people called. Dozens of white vans were investigated. None of them led anywhere. By the end of September, the case was still open, but the leads were drying up. The FBI profiler suggested they were looking for someone local, someone who knew the neighborhood, someone who could move through it without attracting attention. But Bay City was a small town. Everyone knew everyone. How could a killer be hiding in plain sight? That assumption would follow the case for years. The funerals were held on the same day, September 10, 1976, at St. Joseph's Catholic Church in downtown Bay City. The church was packed. People stood in the aisles, lined the back wall, spilled out onto the steps. The 2 small caskets were placed side by side at the front of the altar, covered in white flowers. Linda Morrison couldn't stand. She sat in the front pew, her body shaking, her face buried in her hands. Diane Sullivan stood beside her, one arm around her cousin's shoulders, the other gripping a crumpled tissue. The priest spoke about innocence, about loss, about faith in the face of unimaginable darkness. But his words felt hollow. How do you make sense of two children being ripped out of the world before they'd even started living? After the service, the caskets were carried out to the waiting hearses. The procession moved slowly through the streets of Bay City, past the neighborhoods where the girls had played, past the park where they'd ridden their bikes, past the school they would have attended that fall. People stood on their porches, hands over their hearts, watching in silence. Katherine and Amy were buried side by side in a small cemetery on the outskirts of town. The graves were marked with simple headstones, each engraved with their names, their birthdates, and the single date that ended everything, August 23, 1976. The families tried to go on. Linda Morrison returned to work a month later, moving through her days like a ghost. Diane Sullivan stayed home, unable to face the world. Her marriage began to fracture under the weight of the loss. By the following year, she and her husband had separated. The Morrisons stayed together, but the house on East Taft Street felt like a tomb. They moved 2 years later, unable to live in the place where their daughter had last been seen. The community tried to heal, but the wound was too deep. Parents didn't let their children play outside unsupervised anymore. Block parties stopped. The trust that had once defined Bay City was gone, replaced by suspicion and fear. And the case went cold. For the detectives assigned to the Morrison-Sullivan case, the first few years were relentless. Every few months, a new tip would come in, a name, a rumor, a vague recollection of something suspicious. Each one was investigated. Each one led to nothing. In 1978, a man was arrested in Detroit for the abduction of a young girl. During his interrogation, detectives from Bay City drove down to question him about Katherine and Amy. He denied any involvement. His alibi for August 23, 1976, was weak but couldn't be disproven. He was eventually convicted of the Detroit crime and sent to prison, but he was never charged in connection with the Bay City case. In 1980, a woman called the police, claiming her ex-husband had confessed to her during an argument that he'd done something terrible in Bay City in the summer of 1976. Detectives tracked him down. He was living in Ohio, working construction. They brought him in, questioned him for hours. He admitted to being in Michigan that summer but said he'd been in Lansing, not Bay City. His story checked out. The lead evaporated. By 1985, the case file was thick with dead ends. The original detectives had retired or moved on to other assignments. The evidence, what little there was, sat in a storage room at the Bay City Police Department, filed under Unsolved Homicides. The families still called occasionally, asking if there was any progress. The answer was always the same, no. To the families, the silence was unbearable. To the town, it was something no one wanted to name. The 1990s brought a wave of technological advances in criminal investigation. DNA profiling, which had been experimental in the 1980s, was now standard practice. Cold cases across the country were being reopened, re-examined with tools that hadn't existed when the crimes were committed. Detectives in Bay City knew that the Morrison-Sullivan case had biological evidence, hair fibers, trace material, that had never been tested. But the department was small, resources were limited, and the case was nearly 20 years old. In 1996, a new detective was assigned to the Major Crimes Unit. His name was Robert Keller, and he'd grown up in Bay City. He remembered the summer of 1976. He'd been 11 years old, riding his bike through the same streets where Katherine and Amy had disappeared. He remembered the search parties, the fear, the way his mother had kept him inside for weeks afterward. When Keller saw the Morrison-Sullivan file in the cold case archive, he pulled it. He read through every report, every interview transcript, every tip that had been called in over the years. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He was just looking. And then he found something. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a detail in an interview conducted in September 1976, a week after the bodies were found. A neighbor had mentioned seeing a man standing at the end of East Taft Street on the afternoon the girls disappeared. The man had been leaning against a car, smoking a cigarette, watching the houses. The neighbor said he didn't recognize him, but he didn't think much of it at the time. People parked on that street all the time. The interview had been noted, but nothing had come of it. The man had never been identified. The car had never been found. Keller went back through the file, looking for other mentions of a man or a car. He found 2 more. One from a teenager who'd been walking home from a friend's house and had seen a man sitting in a parked car near the Morrison's block. Another from a woman who'd been watering her garden and noticed a man walking slowly down the sidewalk, looking at the houses. 3 separate people had seen a man in the neighborhood that day. 3 separate descriptions. And no one had connected them. Keller started pulling together the details. The man was described as white, average height, maybe in his 30s or 40s. One witness said he was wearing jeans and a dark shirt. Another said he had short brown hair. The descriptions were vague, but they overlapped enough to suggest they were talking about the same person. Keller began interviewing the original witnesses again. Some had moved away. Some didn't remember. But a few did. One woman, who'd been in her 20s in 1976, still lived on East Taft Street. She remembered seeing a man that day. She said he'd made her uncomfortable. She couldn't explain why. He just felt wrong. Keller asked if she'd recognize him if she saw him again. She said maybe. Probably not. It had been more than 20 years. But she said something else, something she hadn't mentioned in 1976. She said the man had been standing near a house at the end of the block. A house owned by a man named Thomas Ridley. Thomas Ridley was 63 years old in 1996. He'd lived on East Taft Street since 1974, 2 years before Katherine and Amy disappeared. He was a quiet man, unmarried, kept to himself. He worked as a maintenance supervisor for the Bay City School District, a job he'd held for more than 20 years. He was polite, unassuming, the kind of person who blended into the background. He'd been interviewed in 1976, along with every other resident on the street. He'd told police he'd been home that afternoon, doing yard work. He said he hadn't seen the girls, hadn't heard anything unusual. His statement had been brief, unremarkable. There had been no reason to suspect him. Keller pulled Ridley's file. There was almost nothing in it. No criminal record. No complaints. No red flags. But Keller couldn't shake the detail about the man standing near Ridley's house. He started digging deeper. He looked at Ridley's employment history, his background, his family. Ridley had grown up in Bay City, graduated from high school in 1951, served briefly in the Army, and returned to Bay City in the mid-1950s. He'd lived alone for most of his adult life. He had a sister who lived in Grand Rapids, but they rarely spoke. Keller found an old newspaper article from 1969. Ridley's name appeared in a brief mention about a little league team he'd volunteered to coach. The article noted that Ridley had been a fixture at the local baseball fields, and was well-liked by the children. Keller kept reading. He found another mention, this time from 1972. Ridley had been a volunteer at the Bay City YMCA, helping with after-school programs. The article described him as patient and kind, someone the kids trusted. And then Keller found something that made him stop. In 1974, 2 years before Katherine and Amy were killed, a parent had filed a complaint with the YMCA. The complaint was vague, buried in old administrative records that Keller had to request from storage. The parent had expressed concern about Ridley spending too much time alone with children, taking them aside during activities, asking personal questions. The complaint had been reviewed, but no formal action had been taken. Ridley had resigned from the YMCA shortly afterward. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even close. But it was enough to make Keller wonder. Keller brought his findings to his supervisor. The evidence was thin, decades-old witness statements, a complaint that had gone nowhere, and a man who had never been more than a peripheral figure in the original investigation. But the supervisor agreed to reopen the case. They decided to start by re-interviewing Ridley. Keller and another detective drove to Ridley's house on a Tuesday morning in early 1997. Ridley answered the door, looking older but still recognizable from the photos in the file. He invited them in, offered them coffee, seemed calm. Keller explained they were reviewing old cases, going back over details. He asked Ridley if he remembered the day Katherine and Amy disappeared. Ridley said he did. He said it was one of the saddest things he'd ever witnessed. Keller asked if Ridley had seen anything that day. Ridley repeated what he'd said in 1976, he'd been home, working in the yard, hadn't noticed anything unusual. Keller asked about the man who'd been seen standing near Ridley's house. Did Ridley remember seeing anyone? Ridley paused. He said he didn't. Keller asked if anyone had visited him that day. Ridley said no. The interview lasted less than 30 minutes. Ridley was polite, cooperative, and gave no indication of discomfort. Keller left feeling frustrated. There was nothing there. Or if there was, Ridley wasn't going to give it up. But over the next few months, Keller kept pulling at the thread. Keller spent the next year quietly building a profile of Thomas Ridley. He talked to former co-workers, people who'd known him in the 1970s, neighbors who remembered him from that time. Most described him the same way, quiet, polite, a little odd. One former co-worker said Ridley had always been too interested in the children who came through the school district offices, asking their names, where they lived, what grades they were in. Another said Ridley used to volunteer to help with school events, always positioning himself near the younger kids. None of it was criminal. But the pattern was there. Keller also revisited the physical evidence. The hair fibers collected in 1976 were still in storage. He submitted them for DNA testing. The results came back in early 1998. The DNA profile was intact, preserved well enough to be useful. But there was no match in any database. Keller needed a sample from Ridley. Getting one wasn't easy. Ridley had no criminal record, no reason to be in any DNA database. Keller couldn't compel him to provide a sample without probable cause, and everything Keller had was circumstantial. He needed more. He decided to watch Ridley. For months, Keller kept tabs on Ridley's movements. Ridley still lived in the same house on East Taft Street. He'd retired from the school district in 1995 and now spent most of his time at home. He didn't socialize much. He didn't go to church. He didn't have close friends. But once a week, he drove to a diner on the south side of town, where he ate lunch alone, always at the same booth. Keller followed him one afternoon and watched through the window as Ridley finished his meal, paid the bill, and left. After Ridley drove away, Keller went inside and retrieved the coffee cup Ridley had used. It was still sitting on the table, lipstick-free and covered in fingerprints. Keller bagged it carefully and took it to the lab. The DNA was a match. Thomas Ridley's DNA matched the hair fibers found near the bodies of Katherine Morrison and Amy Sullivan in 1976. The match didn't prove Ridley had killed the girls. It proved he'd been at the scene. His defense, if it came to that, would be simple: he'd lived 3 blocks away. He could have walked through that area at any time. The hair could have transferred innocently. It wasn't enough for a conviction. It might not even be enough for an arrest. But Keller wasn't done. He went back to the neighborhood, back to East Taft Street, and started re-interviewing people who'd lived there in 1976. Most had moved. Some had died. But a few were still around. One of them was a woman named Margaret Holt. She'd lived 2 doors down from the Morrisons and had been one of the first people Linda Morrison had asked about the girls that afternoon. Keller sat with Margaret in her living room and asked her to think back to August 23, 1976. She said she remembered it clearly. She'd been home all day. She'd seen the girls playing in the driveway. She'd waved to them from her porch. Keller asked if she'd seen anyone else that day. She thought for a moment and then said yes. She'd seen Tom Ridley. Keller leaned forward. Where had she seen him? She said he'd been walking past the Morrisons' house, maybe around 3:30 or 4 o'clock. She hadn't thought anything of it. Tom walked through the neighborhood sometimes. He was always polite. Always said hello. Keller asked if Ridley had stopped. Had he talked to the girls? Margaret hesitated. She said she wasn't sure. She thought maybe he had. She remembered seeing him pause near the driveway. But she'd gone inside after that. She hadn't seen where he went. Keller asked why she hadn't mentioned this in 1976. Margaret looked down at her hands. She said she didn't think it mattered. Tom was a neighbor. He was harmless. Everyone knew him. That assumption would follow the case for years. In the spring of 1999, Keller presented his findings to the Saginaw County Prosecutor's Office. He laid out everything he had: the DNA match, the witness who'd seen Ridley near the Morrisons' house that afternoon, the pattern of behavior with children, the complaint from the YMCA. The prosecutor listened carefully. When Keller finished, the prosecutor said the evidence was compelling but circumstantial. A defense attorney would tear it apart. The DNA proved proximity, not guilt. The witness's memory was 23 years old. The YMCA complaint had never resulted in charges. The prosecutor told Keller to keep digging. Keller went back to Ridley's past. He found records from the 1960s and early 1970s, years before Katherine and Amy were killed. He discovered that Ridley had briefly worked as a custodian at an elementary school in Flint. Keller contacted the school district, asked if there had been any complaints during Ridley's time there. There had been. In 1968, a teacher had reported that Ridley had been found alone in a classroom with a young student after hours. The teacher said Ridley claimed he was cleaning, but the child seemed upset. The incident was documented but never formally investigated. Ridley had left the position a few months later. Keller also found that Ridley had been questioned in connection with the disappearance of a 10-year-old girl in Saginaw in 1971. The girl had been missing for 3 days before she was found, alive, hiding in a park. She told police a man had tried to convince her to get into his car. She described the man as older, average height, with brown hair. Ridley had been brought in for questioning because he matched the description and had been in Saginaw that day. But the girl hadn't been able to identify him, and Ridley had an alibi: he'd been visiting his sister. The case was closed. It would take decades to understand why that moment mattered. By the end of 1999, Keller had spent 3 years on the case. He had a DNA match, a witness who placed Ridley near the scene, and a history of troubling behavior. But he still didn't have a confession. He still didn't have definitive proof. And time was running out. Ridley was 66 years old. If the case was going to move forward, it had to happen soon. Keller decided to confront Ridley again. In January 2000, Keller and 2 other detectives went to Ridley's house. This time, they weren't asking questions. They were arresting him. Ridley opened the door, and Keller told him he was being taken into custody in connection with the murders of Katherine Morrison and Amy Sullivan. Ridley's face didn't change. He didn't ask why. He didn't protest. He simply nodded, stepped outside, and let the officers handcuff him. At the station, Keller sat across from Ridley in an interrogation room. He laid out the evidence: the DNA, the witness, the pattern. He told Ridley this was his chance to explain. To tell his side. Ridley sat in silence for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't hurt those girls." Keller pressed. He asked Ridley to explain the DNA. Ridley said he'd walked through the area before. Maybe his hair had blown off his clothes. Maybe it had transferred some other way. Keller asked about the witness who'd seen him near the Morrisons' house. Ridley said he didn't remember that. It was a long time ago. Keller asked why Ridley had left the YMCA. Ridley said he'd had other opportunities. 4 hours, Keller pushed. 4 hours, Ridley deflected. He never raised his voice. He never got angry. He just sat there, calm and quiet, giving nothing away. By the end of the interrogation, Keller was exhausted. Ridley was still denying everything. But the prosecutor decided to move forward. In March 2000, Thomas Ridley was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial began in the fall of 2000. The courtroom in Bay City was packed every day. Linda Morrison sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on Ridley. Diane Sullivan sat beside her, gripping her cousin's hand. They'd waited 24 years for this moment. The prosecution's case was built on the DNA evidence, the witness testimony, and the pattern of Ridley's behavior. The lead prosecutor, a woman named Ellen Marsh, walked the jury through the timeline of August 23, 1976. She showed them photos of Katherine and Amy, smiling and alive. She described the moment they disappeared, the frantic search, the discovery of their bodies. She told the jury that Thomas Ridley had been there that day, walking through the neighborhood, and that his DNA had been found at the scene. The defense attorney, a man named Paul Gaines, argued that the DNA was meaningless. He pointed out that Ridley had lived 3 blocks away, that he'd walked through the area dozens of times. He argued that the witness's memory was unreliable after more than 2 decades. He said there was no physical evidence linking Ridley to the actual act of murder, no weapon, no blood, no confession. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury heard from forensic experts, from detectives who'd worked the case, from neighbors who'd known Ridley. They heard from Margaret Holt, who described seeing Ridley near the Morrisons' house that afternoon. Her voice shook as she testified, and she avoided looking at Ridley. The defense called witnesses who described Ridley as a quiet, law-abiding man. They said he'd never been in trouble, never shown any signs of violence. They painted him as a scapegoat, a man being blamed for a crime he didn't commit because the real killer had never been found. On the final day of testimony, the families gave victim impact statements. Linda Morrison stood at the podium, her voice barely above a whisper. She talked about Katherine's laugh, the way she loved to draw, the way she always wanted to help in the kitchen. She said she'd spent 24 years wondering who had taken her daughter and why. She said she'd spent 24 years waiting for this moment. Diane Sullivan spoke next. She talked about Amy's bright blue eyes, the way she followed Katherine everywhere, the way she'd hugged her mother goodbye the morning she died. She said she'd lost more than her daughter that day. She'd lost her faith, her marriage, her sense of safety in the world. She said she didn't know if she'd ever get those things back. When the victim impact statements were finished, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The jury was out for 2 days. On the afternoon of November 8, 2000, they returned with a verdict. Guilty on both counts. The courtroom erupted. Linda Morrison collapsed into Diane's arms, sobbing. Diane closed her eyes, her face pale, her hands trembling. The families hugged, cried, held each other in a way they hadn't been able to in 24 years. Thomas Ridley showed no reaction. He stood as the verdict was read, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression blank. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he shook his head. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Ridley was led out of the courtroom, he glanced briefly at the families. Linda Morrison met his eyes. She didn't look away. She wanted him to see her. She wanted him to know that Katherine and Amy had not been forgotten. If you believe Katherine Morrison and Amy Sullivan deserved someone to keep pushing for the truth, hit that subscribe button. Trolls won't. But people who understand that children's lives matter, even 24 years later, those people will. Because justice delayed is still justice. And silence should never win. He was asked if he believed Ridley would ever confess. Keller said no. He said some people are incapable of accepting responsibility for what they've done. He said Ridley would die in prison still claiming he was innocent, and there was nothing anyone could do about that. But Keller also said the truth didn't need Ridley's cooperation. The evidence spoke for itself. The jury had spoken. And that was enough. When the reporter asked if there was anything else Keller wanted to say, he paused for a long moment. Then he said, "I just hope those little girls know someone fought for them. I hope they know they weren't forgotten." In the years since Ridley's conviction, other cases have been linked to him, though none have been prosecuted. Detectives from across Michigan have reached out to Bay City, asking about unsolved disappearances, assaults on children, incidents that occurred in towns where Ridley had lived or worked. Some of the connections are tenuous. Others are disturbingly clear. In 2003, a woman came forward claiming Ridley had molested her in 1977, a year after Katherine and Amy were killed. She said she'd been 8 years old, that Ridley had been a volunteer at her church, that he'd cornered her in a Sunday school classroom. She said she'd never told anyone because she didn't think anyone would believe her. She said seeing Ridley's conviction on the news had given her the courage to finally speak. She filed a report with the Bay City Police Department. Detectives investigated, but the case was too old to prosecute. The woman said she understood. She said she just wanted it on the record. She wanted people to know. In 2005, another woman came forward with a similar story. Then another. By 2010, 7 women had reported incidents involving Ridley, spanning from the mid-1960s to the early 1980s. None of the cases went to trial. But the pattern was unmistakable. Keller said in a later interview that he believed Ridley's crime stretched back decades, possibly to the 1950s or early 1960s. He said Ridley had likely targeted dozens of children over the course of his life. He said Katherine and Amy were probably not his first victims. They were just the ones he'd been caught for. The graves of Katherine Morrison and Amy Sullivan are still side by side in the small cemetery on the outskirts of Bay City. The headstones are simple, but they're never without flowers. Linda Morrison visits every week, bringing fresh roses, sitting on the grass, talking to her daughter as if she were still there. Diane Sullivan visits less often now. She moved to Arizona in 2012, trying to escape the memories, but she returns every year on August 23. On the 40th anniversary of the girls' deaths, in 2016, the community held a memorial service at the cemetery. More than 200 people attended. There were classmates of Katherine and Amy's who were now in their mid-40s, neighbors who'd helped search for them, detectives who'd worked the case. Linda and Diane stood together at the front, holding hands, as a local pastor spoke about the endurance of love, about the way memory keeps people alive even after they're gone. A small plaque was unveiled near the graves. It read, Katherine Morrison and Amy Sullivan. Beloved daughters, cousins, friends. Taken too soon. Never forgotten. August 23, 1976. After the service, people lingered, sharing stories, crying, hugging. It wasn't closure. Closure isn't possible when children are murdered. But it was acknowledgement. It was a community saying, collectively, that these girls had mattered. That their lives, brief as they were, had left a mark that couldn't be erased. As you're listening to this, I'm curious, what time is it where you are right now? Because wherever you are, whatever time it is, somewhere in this country there's a family still waiting for answers. There's a mother sitting by a window, wondering if today will be the day someone finally calls. There's a detective staring at an old file, wondering if there's one more thread to pull. There's a gravestone no one's visited in years, a name no one remembers. The Morrison-Sullivan case reminds us that time doesn't erase truth. It just buries it deeper. And sometimes, it takes decades to dig it back out. Thomas Ridley will never leave prison. He's 89 years old now, confined to the medical unit of the facility where he's housed. His health is failing. He has no visitors. He receives no mail. He spends his days alone, the same way he spent most of his life. Linda Morrison was asked once if she'd ever want to speak to him, to ask him why. She said no. She said there was nothing he could say that would make a difference. She said she didn't need his reasons. She just needed him to be where he belonged. Diane Sullivan was asked the same question. She said she used to fantasize about confronting him, about screaming at him, about making him understand what he'd taken from her. But she said over time, the anger faded. It didn't disappear, it would never disappear, but it lost its sharpness. She said the best revenge was knowing he'd spend the rest of his life in a cage, forgotten by everyone except the people who put him there. Both women said the conviction didn't bring their daughters back. It didn't undo the years of grief, the sleepless nights, the unanswered questions. But it gave them something they'd lived without for 24 years, certainty. They knew who had killed their girls. They knew he would never hurt anyone again. And they knew Katherine and Amy's story wouldn't be forgotten. That mattered. It still matters. The prosecutor, Ellen Marsh, retired in 2012. Before she left, she gave an interview about the cases she'd handled over her career. When asked which one had stayed with her the most, she didn't hesitate. She said it was the Morrison-Sullivan case. She said what haunted her wasn't the trial or the evidence. It was the thought of how close they'd come to never solving it. If Robert Keller hadn't pulled that file. If he hadn't noticed the pattern. If he hadn't been willing to spend 3 years chasing a man who seemed, to everyone else, like a harmless neighbor. The girls would still be in their graves, and Ridley would still be free. She said the case taught her that justice is fragile. It doesn't happen on its own. It requires people who care enough to keep looking, even when the odds are impossible. Even when everyone else has moved on. She said she hoped other detectives, other prosecutors, would remember that. She said she hoped they'd remember Katherine and Amy. In the end, this case is about more than DNA or interrogations or courtroom tactics. It's about 2 little girls who were playing in a backyard on a summer afternoon, who trusted the world around them, who had no reason to believe that trust would be their undoing. It's about families who refused to let their daughters become statistics, who kept their names alive when it would have been easier to let the pain fade into silence. It's about a detective who couldn't let go, who saw something everyone else had missed, who spent years of his life proving that time doesn't erase accountability. And it's about a community that learned the hardest lesson of all, that safety is an illusion, that evil doesn't always announce itself, and that the people who hurt us are often the ones we least suspect. Katherine Morrison and Amy Sullivan deserve to grow up. They deserve to go to school, to make friends, to fall in love, to have lives full of possibility. They deserve to become the people they were meant to be. They didn't get that chance. But they got something else. They got justice. It came late. It came after years of silence and doubt and dead ends. But it came. And in a world where so many families never get answers, where so many cases go unsolved, where so many children disappear into the void and are never spoken of again, that matters. It matters that someone kept looking. It matters that someone kept fighting. It matters that the truth, buried for 24 years beneath lies and time and a killer's silence, finally came to light. Katherine Morrison. Amy Sullivan. Say their names. Remember them. Not just for how they died, but for how they lived. For the chalk drawings on the driveway. For the laughter in the backyard. For the 5 and 4 years they had on this earth, brief and bright and irreplaceable. They mattered then. They matter now. Rest in peace, Katherine. Rest in peace, Amy. The world failed you. But in the end, it also remembered you. There are thousands of cold cases in this country. Thousands of families waiting. Thousands of names carved into gravestones, gathering dust in courthouses, fading from memory with each passing year. Some of those cases will never be solved. The evidence is gone. The witnesses are dead. The killers have taken their secrets to the grave. But some can be. Some will be. If the right person looks. If the right question gets asked. If someone refuses to let time be the final word. The Morrison-Sullivan case proves that. It proves that decades can pass and justice can still arrive. That a case everyone thought was over can suddenly break wide open. That the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. If you're someone who believes that, someone who believes that every victim deserves a voice, that every family deserves answers, that time should never be a shield for the guilty, then you're the reason these stories matter. You're the reason they get told. You're the reason the names don't disappear. This isn't just a story about a crime that happened in 1976. It's a story about what happens when people refuse to forget. When they refuse to move on. When they hold on to hope even when hope seems irrational, even when everyone else has given up, even when the world tells them to let go. Linda Morrison and Diane Sullivan held on for 24 years. Robert Keller held on for 3. Ellen Marsh held on through a trial that could have gone either way. And because they did, 2 little girls who'd been voiceless for more than 2 decades finally had someone speak for them. That's what justice looks like when it works. Not perfect. Not fast. But real. And if you're listening to this, if you've stayed until the end, then you understand why it matters. You understand why we tell these stories. Why we dig into the past. Why we refuse to let the dead be forgotten. Because every name is a person. Every case is a life. And every life, no matter how brief, deserves to be remembered. Cold cases don't solve themselves. They require tireless effort, resources that are often stretched too thin, and people who refuse to give up. If you know someone who's still waiting for answers, if you've heard a story that's never been resolved, don't let it fade into silence. Share it. Talk about it. Keep it alive. Because somewhere, someone might be listening. Someone who knows something. Someone who's been carrying a secret for decades. Someone who's ready to finally tell the truth. Katherine and Amy's case was solved because one detective wouldn't let it go. Because a neighbor finally spoke up. Because the community, 24 years later, still remembered. Your voice matters. Your memory matters. The stories you carry matter. Don't let them disappear. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and share this with someone you know who values stories like this. I'll see you in the next one.